Welcome to another episode of We the Leaders research discussion. In the last 4 episodes, Ashok, Roop and I have spoken on various findings of the research that have stood out, that has been very clearly, which have come out, and primarily the how leaders in the social impact sector have experienced the changes, the influence that they have, their circles of influence at the micro levels, at the meso levels, at the macro levels, some of their the compromises that they've made, some of the collaborations that they've found easier to make, how they have held co-held different ideologies, focus, purposes, their experiences of dialogues and challenges in this sector, and how they have played the primary roles, the leadership roles in their organizations, and also handled disappointments and fears and anxieties. We've also talked about continuance, sustainability, inheritance, succession in leadership in organizations, and the challenges that many social impact leaders have spoken about. So Ashok, today, for today's session, I would like to start with all the data that we've seen, with all the findings that we've been through. What are, looking at all the data, what are some of the commonalities that you see that energize leaders of the social impact sector? What is it that creates the spark and gives them the go to do what they do and to be what they are?
Well, it'd be easier to say what does not, right?
Okay.
Also, what does? I think what does is quite clear and stands out. The desire to be of service, the desire to make an impact, the desire to make a difference, the angst which they feel vis-a-vis certain social, call it ills, difficulties, etc., to be able to, make their contribution to it is something which I think is quite clearly a very strong motivator for all of them. What their personal payoff in this is, I think that will depend from person to person. All one can say is that in almost all cases, the personal payoff is not likely to be material. It is not something, which can be clearly quantified or clearly say that, it's money or status or anything like that. It's more likely to be psychological. So the payoff for all of them is a psychological payoff would be much stronger. Now for some, and many times they may not even recognize it. For some, it may be the need to experience a certain power and potency in oneself. Well, when you are able to do this, you also feel a certain significance for yourself. For some, it may also be wish to be connected and to wish to find a certain kind of quasi-family in the groups that they work with, rather than their own limited kind of. For some, it could also be, a sense of self-worth, right, which you derive from doing work of this kind. So the specific things would vary, but I think overall one can say that the payoffs for them are likely to be more personal payoffs. Besides, the thing in terms of what they are contributing, are likely to be more psychological than substantive and material.
Is that very distinctive from a corporate leader, for example, or a bureaucrat, who also might, have a certain thing in terms of significance or an identity reinforcement? Is there something distinctive you see in the social sector leaders?
Well, I think there is, for instance, in a corporate thing, if they clear this thing in terms of money, there is a clear this thing in terms of, a certain quality of life that you wish for yourself, and, a certain, call it privileges, etc., but which is not really applicable to this group. For a bureaucrat, it may not be directly money such, but indirectly, it is a lot more. There is, something concrete out there. For these guys, there's nothing concrete per se which they are. So if one was to say, what am I getting out of it? It'll be very difficult to specify it. So it's much less concrete.
Okay. Ashok, are there any, Ashok, when you talk about what are the some of the things that they seem to that keeps the leadership in the sector going, and you started by saying it's easier to say what does not, and you talked about therefore the commonly held things in terms of money, power, status, not in the same obvious way as is often ascribed to other leadership of other sectors. Are there any unintended consequences of this?
Well, the unintended consequences of one is that when it is not very easily visible, the person may not directly acknowledge it. The person may not own it up directly. Right? It is not up front, right there. It's a kind of an extreme example. It's like a parent saying, I'm doing it for my children, and what you are getting out of it is often ignored. And at times it can become, the price is perhaps not the right word, but the consequences of it, one can become totally blind to. Like, for instance, if you look at a person who's codependent, that if a codependent person is all the time working with the belief and assumption that I'm doing it for the other. All right. In what way this person at times can also become, the slightly oppressive, slightly, insensitive. So you must help. Whether the other person needs help or not is not so important. So you can get so caught with what you think is the right thing.
Yeah, I can relate to that in the sense that if I have taken up a certain social cause to work with, and I believe that there is injustice in the current context, and other people, the oppressed people, may not have necessarily come to me and asked me to do it. But I have taken it upon myself, and it's purely an act of volition. In the process, my sense of righteousness might have consequences on people and people's lives that I may not be very aware of, but they are very important to me. And that blindness could have certain unintended consequences, which might take me by surprise after a certain point of time. Are there any dilemmas that you hear from the leaders?
I think, again, there's a lot of commonalities. I think on dilemmas, one can say that virtually all of them have faced the same sets of dilemmas.
Okay.
Okay. You can count them. You can, for instance, the dilemma of focus versus intersectionality of issues. I think almost all of them face it.
Can you elaborate that a little more?
That, if I have to, every issue that I engage with has consequences, implications, other issues are linked to it. Like I think in one of the earlier ones we talked about the interrelatedness between issue of gender discrimination and different sexual orientation. So in a sense that, the issues are related. But if I'm working in gender discrimination, I'm afraid that I may lose focus if I also start indulging in the issue of sex. So these examples are, in some form or the other, they would keep coming up. Also, it can be in terms of different same people but in different locations, there'll be always some variances around it. I think the issues of compulsion of running an organization, an NGO, and vis-a-vis movement, I think many of them talked about this, that, the tension.
Movement versus NGO.
Yeah. Movement versus NGO. And I think you use some other expression, Sangathan
versus Sanstha.
Versus Sanstha. I think that's an issue which very commonly faced by almost all of them. I think
the one thing I think I heard was sort of charity versus rights-based program.
Absolutely. That, because here, you want the people, you want to enable the people to be able to do things by themselves, right? And simultaneously, there is a need for relief. It's like the classical example that do you give a fish to a person or do you teach the person how to fish? Right? There are times when, if the person is so hungry, you can't wait for only to teach the person. You have to first give him a fish. So therefore, this kind of thing would be very thing. I think another thing would invariably come because you need a lot of community support. You need a community support. So therefore, to what extent you will confront the community? Because if you confront the community, you place yourself in a slightly antagonistic position, and it becomes very difficult to then solicit their help.
Also,
then beg your pardon?
Another dilemma I was talking about. First finish, please. First finish.
Then, they need engagement with, let's say, support of governmental bodies, support of donors. So they all have their own agenda. They want their own particular thing. And, whether it's a donor, whether it's governmental agencies, etc. Now, many times you say, okay, there is a sense of compromise. So, in terms of incorporating their interests, their agenda, so you kind of at times feel that will I end up compromising on what I want? Many of them also what happens is oftentimes, particularly in dealing with the other agencies, donors in particular, one felt that there is a sense of not adequate partnership. They place themselves as recipients of, okay, we are getting funds from them. So therefore, I have to, so I'm more of a recipient rather than a partner. So how I can impact the donor, because the donor is also coming, because the donor has some interest in the issue. So therefore, a certain kind of, I sensed lack of partnership between the donor and the NGOs, and it seemed to be like a relationship with a power imbalance. One would say that, look, there would be a power imbalance because the donor is holding the strings. But on the other hand, the NGOs are also holding tremendous competence, tremendous experience, a certain way of doing things. So I'm not sure whether there is adequate partnership between the two bodies. So these are the very common things that you were saying something, Uma. I interrupted you.
No. I was also saying that one thing that you were mentioning very clearly, and we had a good discussion on that, on the need for collaboration versus, keeping one's own ideology in place.
That's right.
Where does collaboration actually force a kind of a compromise? And if you keep to, because NGOs work in networks and consortiums and coalitions, that was also a very strong dilemma that you had talked about in one of the sessions earlier.
So, in your report, therefore, you have come up with certain recommendations. And one of the things that strikes me, Ashok, you talk about some kind of a collective space like a caucus. Now, traditionally, leadership development has always been on a personal investment, as in a leader attends a leadership program and builds his or her competency in leadership, and that's how it is. Most leadership programs run. Over here, you're suggesting rather than doing that, you're talking about building a caucus and a shared space in some kind of a group space. Can you tell us a little bit more about why you think that that would be a preferred way to take this forward?
Well, I'm working here with some assumptions.
Okay.
One, I think the kind of issues and dilemmas which these leaders face, no one has the answer. No one has a clear, ready-made answer. So you can't run a typical leadership program and tell them about leadership skills, etc. No, that's perfectly fine in a relatively more, what you would call, professional setup. Now, there is a need for professionalization here, but that professionalization is of a very different kind. So there is no ready-made thing which can be given to these people. They can only in some ways learn from each other. Their own experience and a space for them to reflect, a space for them to join each other and see how can they find some new ways, new alternatives and stuff like that. I also recommended that strongly because one picked up a lot of loneliness in these people. There is a need for a shared space. There is a need to share your experience, hear from other people, listen to them, engage with each other. So that's why I think the issues of these cannot be addressed through typical management leadership development programs. I think they'll be I personally feel they'll be of very limited use. On the other hand, spaces where they can in some ways invest in themselves. There is a huge need for them to invest in themselves and invest in each other. I realize that, when you are basic, this thing is coming, that self is secondary. The idea of investment in yourself may not be all that easy. It may also be difficult to justify. It may be just difficult to justify to whoever is, funding it or whatever is, because there may not be any direct, what you would call,
any direct impact, tangibly, that can project. If this is treated as a project and one is looking for very specific deliverables and outputs and predicted results, then one can create trappings that might be self-defeating. Because then whoever is coming for such a program will start looking at themselves as instruments again for delivery.
Absolutely. They have to be dialogue spaces. They have
open-ended exploratory
dialogue spaces.
Right. Okay, I think that's a very interesting thing. I mean, the question is for all of us is now that we've almost completed 5 episodes of this sharing, and I'm sure some of it may be clear, some of it may trigger many questions, some of it may be very unclear. So we will be really looking forward to questions and people to get back to us in terms of if they have any questions. Meanwhile, as a We the Leaders research program, I think we would be offering a couple of workshops to people if there is a sufficient interest. It is not an agenda that we carry for ourselves. However, if some of what we are talking about, the research is talking about, what Ashok has suggested, if this should make sense, then we are committed to creating some of those workshop spaces and holding that. Yeah. What do you think?
So yeah, you can write back to us. You please you can connect with us with the links that are given below, and we would wish to hold sessions, and like Ashok is saying, more charcha, more dialogues with leaders, about leaders, to each other. I think that's the way to go. So we look forward to hearing from anyone and everyone who's interested in having these dialogues with us. Thank you very much, Ashok, for.
Thank you. It's been wonderful, sharing and talking to the two of you. Very, very enriching. And